All right, friends, welcome in. I will get started here. Um, as far as I know there was an outage earlier that affected Zoom, but fingers crossed, so far it's working okay. Um, but I'm aware of that, so hopefully we'll be good. Couple of updates just to make sure we're all on the same page. So, because we're a little behind, which was my own doing, we're getting caught up this week. We'll get into the lesson about sex and gender, but it's very likely that I will not finish it today. So, we're going to stay on schedule with having your next exam next week. However, when we're done today, I will take notes of where we left off, and I will review the study guide and the exam and make sure that if it's something we don't get to today, I will not ask you about on this exam. It could be covered on the final, but I will make sure that I don't have anything on the exam that we don't get to today. So, we are plugging along though, and we've got a little bit left over from making a living, and then we'll get into sex and gender. And yeah, I'll just start in. So I believe this is where we left off. We were talking about non-industrial societies and how they have a more intimate relationship with the products they use. So, for example, land is usually passed from one generation to the next, usually through family and marriage. But in a non-industrial society, land is usually not as strictly bordered as it is here. Here in the US, my property lines are very strict, meaning if I want to put up a fence, I have to make sure it's on my property line and not getting onto my neighbor's property. Because if my neighbor's unhappy with that fence, they can take me to court and say, here's proof, it's over on my property, and have it taken down. The difference in a smaller scale society is that it's usually a little more loose. You'll kind of have the idea of like this acreage, this field is my family's, but we don't have as strict lines. And labor tools, technology is usually not specialized. Everyone participates. So it might be a certain gender does certain roles or a certain age group does certain roles, but it will be something like all women between the ages of, say, 14 and 30 know how to make pottery. Rather than when we get industrialized, that's how we end up with specialization. So you have like one person in the village that is the potter, or one person that's the butcher. Versus a non-industrial, it's kind of everybody knows how to do that. Now, when I talk about industrial societies being really far removed from our products, I want to bring up smartphones. So it's 2025. I use a smartphone. Technically, I have an iPhone. I have owned iPhones for, oh wow, 15 years. 15 years I've had an iPhone. Not the same one, but an iPhone. And for me, it's less about brand loyalty and more about, I'll be honest, it's laziness on my part. I don't want to learn a new operating system. I got used to how Apple iOS works. It may not be perfect, but I don't feel like learning a new one. So I keep buying iPhones. But in 2025, it's difficult, not impossible, but difficult to live and function without a smartphone. We use it for social media, but we use it for work emails. Depending on your job, you may actually use it to clock in. Like we use them for everything now. So when I bring this up, this is not to make you feel bad if you have a smartphone. That's why I mentioned that I have one too. But we need to be aware of the living and working conditions of the people who are making these smartphones. Linked on this slide, if you want to watch it, is a short news clip about some of the conditions. Warning, though, something they do talk about throughout the video is they are seeing a high number of suicides happening with their workers. These factories are over in, for example, China, and they have incredibly long hours, very tedious work. The pay is very bad, and they have to live on campus, usually 8 people to a room. So the struggle is the people making our products are living pretty crappy lives. That is not me saying, and therefore you should never use a smartphone. What I am saying is we're allowed to use the product while also advocating for better conditions for the employees. And I will say in the video, what's frustrating is they talk to one of the bosses and he kind of excitedly shows them that, oh, they have some counselors now. They have a hotline people can call. They have like de-stress rooms where you can beat up a dummy. And that's all well and good. But I think the main issue is the working conditions are bad and the pay is awful. And if people can afford leisure activities, then their mental health is going to improve. So it's a little frustrating that he's just like, I don't know what's happening. But that is something we're seeing. So we need to make sure that the people making our products, even though I'm never going to know the name of the person that made my iPhone, I would like to know that they're living an okay life while they're making this much needed product. And that's what this little comic is about on this screen, if you want to read it. It's basically somebody being very critical of Apple products while using an iPhone. And a guy kind of pops out of nowhere and says, like, oh, you're being critical, but you use the product. And then it gives you a couple of historical examples of people who used a product while still advocating for safer or better conditions. Economizing refers to the allocation of scarce means or resources among alternative ends. Now, when I say peasant, a lot of us are imagining a peasant like in the bottom right-hand corner, somebody from the medieval era, very poor, and some of those are still correct, but the modern day equivalent of a peasant is a small-scale agriculturalist who lives in state-organized societies and have rent funds obligations. So what that means is they're small-scale agriculturalists who do not own their property. So if you own your own property and you want to grow crops to sell, then you get to keep most of the profit. Sure, some of the money is going to go back into your operation or, pay on a mortgage, but the difference with the mortgage is once you pay it off, you own that property outright. Versus for a lot of you, if you rent, you probably are aware that when you pay your rent every month, you're not going to get any of that back. When you're done renting, they keep that money. You might get your security deposit back, but the rent is gone. So this is where we're seeing peasants nowadays, people that do not own their property and are having to work even harder to be able to make a profit while also paying rent. Something we see a lot in capitalist societies is the market principle. Now, if you happen to be an economics major, you may have way more details on this than I do. But to just kind of explain it, it's the buying, selling, and valuation based on supply and demand. This is what dominates capitalist societies. We use money to buy and sell things. So technically, you use your labor to buy things. But in a barter society, which I'll kind of get to in a few slides, I would actually barter my labor. So I would say, hey, you need to sell this used car. How about I deep clean your entire house and you give me the car? Versus in capitalism, I don't sell my labor to the car salesman. I sell my labor somewhere else. Maybe I work at McDonald's. And in trade for my labor, they give me whatever minimum wage is an hour. And then in turn, I take the money I earned and trade that for products or services. We a lot of times see bargaining in our society. There's not too many times where we actually get to bargain. It tends to be really big purchases. So, for example, if I go to Meijer and I buy some groceries and I go to the checkout and they say your total is $149, I cannot turn to the Meijer cashier and say, "Ooh, 149 is really expensive. How about I give you 125?" The Meijer employee does not have any control over the prices. They cannot barter with me. But if you go buy a used car or sometimes a new car, or if you're buying a house, there's room to bargain where you're allowed to say, "Oh, you want $350,000 for this house? I don't think it's worth that because it needs a new roof. If you knock off 30,000, because that's about what I'll have to pay for a roof, then I'll take it." And yeah, the other person is definitely allowed to say no, but a lot of times they'll say yes and go down a little bit. What we also see in the market principle is things cost more when they're scarce. Think of surge pricing. We see that it really started with apps like Uber and Lyft. If I go, so right now I'm working in my office in downtown Grand Rapids. Actually, right now is a good time. So earlier today, let's say 2 o'clock in the afternoon, if I wanted to take an Uber home, it would probably cost me about $15 plus whatever I tip. Versus with surge pricing, they know that around 5 p.m., everybody gets out of work. More people will need rides. So then my Uber's probably going to cost $22 plus tip. And it gets even worse. Let's say somebody big comes to Grand Rapids. Let's say we have a new amphitheater going in. Let's say they get Taylor Swift. And even if I don't go to the Taylor Swift concert, but it's time when the concert is ending and I need an Uber, it's going to be like $30 because they know people are desperate. So, getting into reciprocity, I'm not going to spend too much time on this particular slide because I'm going to introduce you to the three types of reciprocity on the next three slides. But defined here, reciprocity is the principle governing exchanges among social equals. So it's basically the social expectations of when and how gifts are expected and how we perceive a correct reciprocation of a gift. So we're going to go over three different ways: generalized, balanced, and negative. So generalized is probably one you're more familiar with. These are exchanges among closely related individuals. It is expected that an equal level of gift will be given in return. It is usually talking about casual gift giving, and it is not an immediate return. So, to try and give a real world example, when I say an equal level of gift is expected in return, I have coffee on the slide because I'm a big coffee drinker. So let's say me and my friend go out for the day and we're going to run some errands and just do fun things and hang out in each other's company. But to kick things off, I say, "Hey, let's hit Bigby. I'll get you a coffee." And my friend says, "Thank you very much." And we don't have a written contract. We've never even sat down and talked about these rules. But the expectation is they will get me a gift of equal value at a later time. I say at a later time because if we use coffee as an example, now, I'm the exception to the rule because I love coffee, but for most people, if you go with your friend and you buy 2 cups of coffee for you and your friend, and then they turn around immediately and buy 2 more cups of coffee for you guys, you're gonna probably think that's way too much coffee. Like I said, me, I'd be like, "Yay, 2 coffees." But for most people, that's too much. The expectation is it's gonna be later. Now, where it can be a little tricky is it doesn't have to be a coffee. Maybe I buy our coffees at the beginning of the day, and then later in the day, they buy us a sweet treat, a cupcake or something. Similarly priced, but still a casual gift giving and later in the day. Or the expectation is when we go out next time, they're going to buy my coffee. The unwritten rule is if they never reciprocate, I'm probably going to stop buying them gifts. So let's say we go out, I buy our coffees. Great. Couple weeks later, we go out again, I buy our coffees. Okay. And this continues. Eventually, I might start to think, man, I'm always buying their coffee and they never get my coffee. Maybe I should stop buying them coffee. Now, the reason why I mentioned that this is usually among peers is because it looks a little different if one of you is significantly more financially stable. So, for instance, if I go out with my best friend and I buy us coffee, and then later that day she buys me an iPad, I'm going to feel very unequal. I'm going to feel like, whoa, that's a really big gift compared to a cup of coffee. But let's say the friend in question is not my childhood best friend, but is Jeff Bezos, the leader of Amazon. I'm not friends with Jeff Bezos, but if I was, and I bought us coffee and he bought me an iPad, I would probably say, thank you very much for the iPad, Jeff, because to him, that's the equivalent of a cup of coffee. Versus me and my bestie, that's a big purchase. So, yeah, that's a little extreme. Your friend is probably not going to buy you an iPad, but it has to be of equal value. Similarly, if I bought my friend an $8 latte and then they bought me a $1 pencil, I might feel a little like, come on, that's not the same. Like it's an unwritten rule or expectation. Balanced reciprocity is a little different. These are exchanges between people who are more distantly related than are members of the same band or household. So, in generalized reciprocity, it's people I know pretty well. I'm either related to or I hang out with regularly. Balanced reciprocity is fellow townspeople or maybe a work colleague who I know in passing, and maybe we've had a couple conversations, but we're not super close. This is when a person pays a certain amount for a good or service in direct exchange for that good or service at the moment of purchase. We kind of do that in our society, but the difference is we're exchanging money. So we have to decide, okay, I want to hire somebody to mow my lawn. So I call around and see what the best rate is. And let's say they want to charge $100 to mow my front lawn. I can say, no, that's too much and continue to shop around. Or I can think that's a steal or that's a good deal or an equal match and pay it. Or in balanced reciprocity, it doesn't have to be money. So, kind of like the picture on the screen. If I talk to a colleague and maybe we're complaining about our weekends coming up and that we both have a lot of work to do, and I say, ugh, I have to mow my front lawn. I hate mowing my front lawn. And my colleague says, well, that's nothing. I love mowing lawns. I have to do 3 loads of laundry and I hate laundry. And I say, I actually like doing laundry. So then we strike up a bargain and I say, hey, how about Friday night? I come over, I do all your laundry, we can chit chat. And then Saturday, you come over and mow my lawn. It's an immediate exchange. Both parties have agreed, yes, this is comparable. I agree that mowing a lawn is equal to 3 loads of laundry or baking a dinner, cooking a dinner, something like that. We have to agree to it and it's immediate. Now, negative reciprocity, we don't see as often. This is potentially hostile exchanges among strangers. The examples I've included are the horse culture of the Plains Native Americans, which I will explain, and price gouging. So, price gouging we see more often. Some people would argue that the concept of surge pricing is price gouging. Technically, legally, it does not count because we do have some legal walls up to stop price gouging from happening. But so far, we're okay with surge pricing. Price gouging looks like something that is a desperate need, something that is required, and we are withholding it for an exorbitant amount of money. So we see this after like natural disasters. Places will have their drinking water turned off, and then somebody shows up on Facebook Marketplace selling jugs of water for $50 a jug, something ridiculous because they know we need water to survive, and some people are going to be desperate enough to pay for it. We saw that a lot during COVID lockdown. When everybody started to run out of toilet paper, I saw people, they got in trouble for it, rightfully so, but people that had gone out and bought all the toilet paper and then were selling it for like 30, $40 for, like 10 rolls, something ridiculous. So that's an example of price gouging. The horse culture of the Plains Native Americans, also called Plains Indians, we're talking, I'm trying to remember which states are included, but I know it's North and South Dakota, I think parts of Montana and Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, like right down the middle of the country. In this area, the Native Americans that have lived there for generations, when horses were reintroduced to North America, they became very, very important. And they were very important to the Native Americans. So what happened is you would have different tribes that knew of each other but weren't friends. In fact, a lot of them were hostile to each other. And so what would happen is you would have, this is kind of putting it briefly, you would have tribe A and tribe B. And tribe A, one night, a bunch of young men get restless and think, let's go mess with tribe B. So they sneak over and they steal 10 horses. Tribe B wakes up the next morning, immediately notices they're missing 10 horses, and goes, I know who did this. It was tribe A. So then later in another night, they come over and steal back the 10 horses plus another 10. This cycle back and forth continued on and on. Now, what's interesting is it was great for the evolution of the horses because it created genetic diversity rather than little pockets of horses that only bred with each other. They were constantly getting mingled and shifted around. But it was very hostile. There were wars that broke out, deaths that happened over these horses. But it was the expectation that if I go steal horses, they're gonna retaliate. They're gonna come and either fight me or take my horses. And it just kind of went on and on and on for a long time. If you're interested in reciprocity, a great historic writing is The Gift by Marcel Mauss. He was a French sociologist. And I say historic because it is 100 years old. This was published in 1925. It is a fascinating read. And if I'm going to summarize it in one sentence, the basic concept is Mauss talks about how in very basic terms, no gift is ever free, meaning, even when we think, I am giving this gift out of the kindness of my heart, we're usually still expecting something in return. It might not be another gift, it might be we're expecting friendship or something like that, but that we're expecting something. And like I said, that's me trying to summarize this into one sentence, but that's pretty much what he's talking about. And reciprocity in our culture is very important. We even have the saying, if you've ever heard somebody say, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. It's an older phrase going back a couple hundred years. Usually we say it when somebody asks too many questions about something good or a gift. So, like if you're a kid, let's say somebody gives you a gift and you start asking, like, how much was this? Where did you get it? Blah, blah, blah. You may have been told, ooh, don't look a gift horse in the mouth, saying it's rude to ask those questions. Or if something lands in your lap, say you get a promotion you weren't really trying for, and you start to ask, well, how was I qualified? You might be told, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. Long story short, this goes to you can tell a lot about an animal's health by their teeth. And when horses were the main form of transportation, it was considered rude if someone gave you a free horse to inspect its mouth for health. You're supposed to just say, thank you for the free horse. But it's the equivalent of if you go car shopping and you look under the hood, that's what we used to do. If you went horse shopping, you would open their mouth and inspect their health. And we still have that saying alive today. If you are following along on the PowerPoint, I might skip the occasional slide for time. But just as a heads up, you're not going crazy. I am skipping the occasional slide. So just didn't want you to be like, where did that slide go? I took it away. Now, redistribution to kind of get into potlatches to wrap up this lesson. Redistribution is the flow of goods from the local level into a center and then back out. It is characteristic among chiefdoms, tribes that have a singular person chief in charge. Trying to come up with a Western example, a modern Western example, the best idea I could come up with was taxes. Now, it's not perfect, but the basic concept of taxes, and I'll bring this up again, is let's say it's, April 15th. We've all paid our taxes and we all pay our state taxes. Now, I'm not going to make us argue over whether or not we think our tax dollars are spent correctly because we might all disagree on that. Some are going to say absolutely, others are going to say no. But the main concept is we all pay a percentage into the city or the state, and then the state collects that money and uses it to make their budgets for bettering our society. That's how it's supposed to work. Like I said, I won't make you discuss and debate if it does, but that's the idea. So redistribution is that we are collecting from our citizens, putting it in a central location, and then redistributing it back out. So look at with like federal and state taxes. If you paid more than your share, you're going to get some back. Versus if you didn't pay enough throughout the year, you owe some. Now, I've mentioned how anthropologists and academics love really long titles of papers. The additional reading by D. Bruce Johnson is Potlatch Economy, Reciprocity Among Northwest Coast Indians. This was published only a couple years ago in 2023, and it explores the custom of potlatch performed by the Native Americans First Nations of the Pacific Northwest coast of North America, abbreviated here as NWC for Northwest Coast. It's a little debated what geographically is included in the Pacific Northwest, but this is kind of the general area. Most people agree that at the bare minimum, Pacific Northwest refers to the western halves of British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon. Some people argue it includes the entire states as well as parts of Idaho. I would argue, even though it's included in the little diagram, Wyoming is not the Pacific Northwest. It's beautiful, don't get me wrong, but it's not the Pacific Northwest. But that's what we're talking about. Potlatch as a ceremony has been practiced throughout the Northwest coast, and they have occupied this land for at least 14,000 years. Now, I say at least because my little warning is, like I've mentioned before, Anthropologists know at least they've been there 14,000 years. If you talk to the people, they're going to say they've been here way longer. And we are now starting to discover evidence that they're probably right. However, until we have peer-reviewed empirical evidence, that's why we usually say about 14,000 years. But I would argue they've probably been there even longer. A potlatch is a competitive feast within the Pacific Northwest. It is a redistribution of wealth. Basically, in times of bounty, where hunting has been good, harvesting has been good, and everybody has plenty of things to go around. What will happen is a chief will perform basically a tax and go around and collect the excess from his people. Then he will hold a potlatch where they redistribute those goods to the public as well as visitors. Potlatches get very competitive. So it'll be something like the Salish, which I just listed two tribes, Salish and Kwakiutl. There's a bunch more, but if you want to know more about them, there's two you can look into. Basically, you would have the Salish, and then the Salish would be divided into two moieties or halves. And one moiety would throw a potlatch and invite over the other moiety. And when they get there, everybody gets a goodie bag, so to speak. And in this goodie bag is a pound of salmon jerky and a blanket. And everybody's happy. Everyone's like, this is awesome. I love my goodie bag. And they go home. And the moiety that did not throw the potlatch would then say, okay, that was a pretty good potlatch. We need to one up them. So we're going to throw a potlatch next and invite them back over. And this time, everybody's goodie bag is going to have a copper pot, two blankets, a pound of jerky, and a pint of milk. I don't know. I'm trying to think of something that would be included. But basically, more than the first group. And what happens is, after that potlatch, the original group now wants to one up them, and this cycle continues. They are cultural adaptations to alternating periods of local abundance and shortage. It's a way to make sure that everybody has enough so that you are spreading the wealth literally back out through the people. Famously, Franz Boas worked with the Northwest Coast tribes, and he also studied potlatch ceremonies. Basically, for a lot of chiefdoms, chiefs are elected officials. They are not quite like kings. With a king, you become king because your dad was king. And when he dies or steps down, you become king. We just saw that happen. America doesn't have kings, but the British Empire does. And we saw that happen a few years ago. Queen Elizabeth had been one of the longest reigning queens in their history, and she passed away. It wasn't until she passed away that King Charles took his throne. Um, this is not me trying to say anything about King Charles' leadership. I'm not British, so what do I know? But he did not get that position because of his diplomacy or because the people elected him. He got that position by birthright. Versus chiefs are usually elected, meaning the people have to decide, yes, I want this person to be our chief. Now, can you have dynasties like we do in our politics where a family has a lot of politicians? So could you have a chief whose dad was also a chief? Yeah, absolutely. But they have to keep their position. So the more generous a chief was, the higher ranking he was. And we see that even in our politicians. Um, we know one of the things we do with our presidents is we track their approval rating, where we go out and we poll and survey not everybody in the country, but a big group, and we look at how well he's doing. and then we report back. And that too, whatever's sitting president, kind of signifies how well they're doing. Are we happy with their term? And the happier we are, the more likely we are to re-elect them next time they're up. Coderre was quoted as saying, the ostentatious and dramatic distribution of property by the holder of a fixed, ranked, and named social position to other position holders. Basically saying that's what a potlatch is. It is the chief collecting everything and then deciding who gets what. Hypothecation refers to the act of pledging an asset as security for a debt, with the borrower retaining possession of the asset and the lender having a right to seize it on default. We also practice this same basic concept. So, within potlatch capital markets, the idea is if I want to borrow something from my neighbor, let's say I want to go fishing and I don't have a fishing pole, and I ask my neighbor, can I pretty please borrow your fishing pole? I'll give it back, I promise. But my neighbor has been talking to our other neighbors, and they're telling them, do not trust Stephanie with your fishing pole. I didn't lend her my fishing pole, but I lent her a shovel and she broke it and refused to replace it or repair it. Or they say, she borrowed a pot from me and never gave it back. They're going to be less likely to lend me that fishing pole because they're not going to trust my reputation. What's interesting is we kind of do that in our country. So we did it a little more complicated. We invented something called credit scores, which are relatively new, like only in the last few decades did we develop credit scores. And the way a credit score is supposed to work is it tracks how much debt I have, how how well I'm repaying that debt, meaning, am I taking out more debt than I can pay back? Am I making my payments on time? And we use that when I want to borrow more money. So if I need a new car, I don't have, especially if I want a brand new car, I don't have like 40 grand just sitting in my bank account ready to go. I'd have to go to the bank and get a car loan. And the same basic concept exists as the next slide, or slide, I can't talk, the next bullet point. The borrower relied on the strength of their name as collateral, and they retain possession of the asset. So if I go to the bank and say, pretty please, can I have 40 grand for a car? They will look at my credit score and assess if I am trustworthy. If they say, yes, she's trustworthy, here's 40,000 for the car. I get to drive the car right away. The bank doesn't keep the car until I pay it off and then I get it. I get the car, even though I owe the 40 grand. The agreement is if I stop making my payments, the bank legally can come take that car away because I haven't lived up to my end of the bargain. So, like Johnson says, it's not money per se, but trust that drives any fractional reserve system. In a potlatch ceremony, we need to trust our chiefs when they say, I'm going to take these goods, but I'm going to redistribute them. We need to trust them that they're going to do it fairly, because if they don't, then we can call for them to be removed. Now, these little laws here, it's just a quick timeline. This is technically Canadian laws, but the US had very similar timeline of legalization of potlatch. So in 1885, the House of Commons amended the Canadian Indian Act, and they made potlatch illegal. All related activities were also considered a misdemeanor, meaning if they caught wind in 1890 that a potlatch ceremony was happening, they could and did raid them, arrest people, and confiscate all of the cultural things like masks and totem poles and all of the redistributed wealth. So think of it like taxes. Let's say state taxes. April rolls around. We all pay our state taxes. And I know that Governor Whitmer doesn't like personally collect the money, but let's say she does. Humor me. So let's say Governor Whitmer is sitting in her office with all of the collected tax money, and she says, "Oh, I can't wait to budget our new state government and redistribute this wealth back to the people." And then the Ohio governor comes in because Michigan doesn't like Ohio. We don't get along. So Ohio governor comes in and says, "Actually, we just made this illegal." And he confiscates all of our money and says, "No more for you." And throws the governor in jail. Now we're down a governor and we're down all of our tax money that was supposed to go back and be redistributed to the people, now is just gone. So that's what was happening with potlatches. In 1918, Canadian authorities made potlatching a summary offense, meaning it was still, you'd still get in trouble, you'd still have things confiscated, but you wouldn't go to prison. You would just get a fine. And then finally in 1951, the restrictions were lifted, making potlatch legal again. The problem is for what is that, like 64 years? It was more than that, 66. I can't do math. Anyways, over 60 years. It was illegal. So what happens when you take it away from an entire generation? Now you have the younger crowd in the 50s saying, "Hey, let's do a potlatch. We're allowed to now." And then looking at their elders and realizing they've never done a potlatch because it was illegal. And now they're kind of scrambling, like, does anybody remember how? Also, all of our artifacts are now in museums. Like, how do we redo this? So we're seeing a little bit of a change. We're seeing a resurgence in them where people are now celebrating more of their heritage, but they're also adapting to modern ways of trading. So, like, I have seen pictures of some potlatches from the 1980s where it's basically a swap meet, where they will tell people, "Hey, go through your house, clean out your house. Anything you don't want, bring it to the auditorium. And then we're going to set up, and place, this section is going to be for luggage, and this section is going to be for clothing, and this section is going to be for kitchenware." And everybody can go through and barter and trade and take what they need and leave what they don't. It's a modern adaptation, but it's also a way to keep the tradition alive and grow from it. Traditions change as societies change, so that's normal, but it's great, in my opinion, that we're starting to see a resurgence in potlatches. Okay. That's the end of that one. So we will segue in to gender and sex, covering Kotak Chapter 9 and the Martin article, which is, in comparison to the other articles I use, it is one of the older ones. If I remember correctly, it's from 1991, so probably older than a lot of you, but I still think it's a relevant, good article. So, sex versus gender. In our society, we sometimes conflate or say sex when we mean gender or gender when we mean sex. It is very confusing. It's not something I'm going to harp on too much, but to define the differences, sex is the male, female, or intersex division of a species, especially as differentiated with reference to the reproductive functions. Versus gender is the cultural construction of whether one is female, male, or something else. Now, a couple of additions. When I say or something else, that is not me trying to be dismissive of other gender options outside male and female. It's rather me trying to be inclusive. I'll bring up some examples, but when we look culturally at the world, there are many different societies that have third through sixth gender options, rather than America is really fixated on just the binary of two. So there's no way I could list all the different gender options out there in the world. It would get very confusing. So that's why I include everybody under something else. Now, it's interesting in like neurology, looking at our brain chemistry and science, male and female humans do have slightly different brain chemistry. It's not so different that we are different species or that we are so completely different we can't get along or anything like that. But it's interesting to see that our brains do function a little differently than the other sex. In a lot of species, we see what's called sexual dimorphism. This is the marked differences in male and female anatomy and temperament. So, humans have pretty low sexual dimorphism. Yes, obviously, there are some physical characteristics that are different for men and women. We know the genitals are going to be different, and we know the chest area is going to be different. But we also know that on average, male humans are usually a little larger than female humans. Now, I say on average because we have had lots of discussions in our culture around height and size, and know that some women are very large and some men are much smaller. We love a short king. There's nothing wrong with that. Just like there's nothing wrong with being a very tall woman. But on average, males tend to be a little larger. But our differences are small enough that they're not easily picked out. Meaning, if you, as an average person with basic biology who has not studied in-depth physical anthropology, if I show you two human skeletons side by side, it's going to be really hard for you based off size to pick which one is male and which one is female. Now, are there some other distinct differences that if you're studied in physical anthropology, you can pick out? Yeah. But if I just show you two skeletons side by side, it's going to be hard to be like, oh, that's the female, because it's not that distinct. Versus, I'll show you an example of a species that is. And Ernestine Friedel said the biological nature of men and women should be seen not as a narrow enclosure limiting the human organism, but rather as a broad base upon which a variety of structures can be built. And she said that back in 1975, basically encouraging us to think of male and female humans as building blocks rather than the end of a road. So we have a tendency to think of there's male and female, and that's it. Friedel is saying we can look at it and say there's definitely male and there's definitely female, but then we have a bunch of different options physically and culturally that don't fit in that binary. Now, an example of animals with really low sexual dimorphism, and they're very cute, we have gibbons. They are one of the lesser apes. They are monogamous, so they mate for life. And you can see that the males and females are not that different in size, and they're not that different in temperament, meaning they're both equally as aggressive, equally as intelligent, equally as parental, versus some species, like if we look at gorillas, one of the great apes, the males are significantly larger than the females, and the males are usually more aggressive than the females. Versus gibbons, they're pretty much equal. I think geographically, the closest gibbons we have, I believe they still have a mated pair at Binder Park Zoo down in Battle Creek, if you ever want to check them out. But a great example of high sexual dimorphism are peafowl. The boys are peacocks and the girls are peahens. And you can see in the bottom picture, you have a peahen in the front and a peacock in the back. The hen is slightly smaller. Actually, I think she's a little bigger. Sorry, she's a little bigger. But she has very brown gray feathers, muted colors. She does have a little crown on her head, but it's not as distinct as the male. That is because she's the one sitting on the nest, so she needs to hide from predators. Versus the male uses all of those bright, colorful, huge feathers for two things: to scare off predators and to attract the ladies. So he needs to be big and showy and bright and colorful. It's also great to kind of scare predators. We know if you're a hiker, a lot of us are told if you encounter like a black bear, to make yourself look big, to try to look scary. It may not always work, but it's an idea. Same basic concept. A predator's coming at this peacock. He can fluff out his feathers and look bigger than he is. Now, the downside of these feathers is he's not very agile in the air. They can fly, but not very well. So if he has to flee a predator, they can kind of slow him down. But this is marked, really distinct sexual dimorphism. Looking at gendered expectations. So there was a study first published in 1935 and then republished in 1950 called Sex and Temperament in Three Primitive Societies, and it was by Miss Margaret Mead. Now, the little asterisk I have next to primitive is just a reminder. Nowadays, we do not call societies of people primitive, because we learned it can be very dismissive and can denote unilinear evolutionism. But in 1935 and 1950, it was totally acceptable. The other thing to bear in mind is gendered expectations in the West during this time frame. So in the US and Europe, the expectation during this time was that men were going to be the primary breadwinners. They were going to be politicians and leaders. They were going to be aggressive. They were going to care less about drama and like physical characteristics. And they're going to be more hands-off parents. Versus women were expected to be catty, gossipy, dramatic, um, less managerial, but better at domestic chores like parenting. So that was the expectation of men and women. Not saying that everybody fit into that neat box, but that was the expectation. So Mead went to Papua New Guinea, which is a relatively small island, but has a very diverse group of people. And she studied three different tribes. Now, also, please forgive me. My pronunciation probably isn't great of the tribe names, but I do my best. So, she saw the Arapesh. Here, both men and women acted mild, parental, and very responsive, or as how Westerners expected women to act. Everybody, regardless of gender or sex in the Arapesh, acted this way. The Mondogomor were the opposite. Both men and women acted fiercely and aggressively. They weren't necessarily bad parents, but they weren't as hands-on. And that is how we were expecting at the time that men would act. So here she has two tribes where it's not gender specific. You have one acting like how we expect women and one acting like how we expect men. Then, to throw another wrench into the plan, she introduces us to the Chambuli. Here, it was the opposite of Western expectations. So men were catty, gossipy. They did their hair. They went shopping. Women were energetic, managerial, and they placed less attention on personal adornment. So nowadays, we pretty much know that, sure, a lot of women may act a certain way in our culture, and a lot of men may act a certain way, but we now understand that there's always expectations to the rules. But we used to be a little more strict about it. And this study helped anthropologists and the general public to kind of look at this argument we were having of, is it nature or is it nurture? Saying, Are we biologically predisposed to act certain ways, or do we act that way because that's what our culture dictates? And Mead's little study here, I shouldn't say little, that sounds very dismissive, but her study here is saying, yeah, it's more nurture than nature. It's less biologically inherited of how we act and more tied to how we are raised and what is expected from us. You've heard of gender roles before. These are the tasks and activities that a culture assigns to each sex. It will largely depend on the environment, the economy, the adaptive strategy, and the type of political system. If you are living in, say, a forager lifestyle, a small band of people, and you know hunting is dangerous and staying home with the kids, not to say it's 100% safe, but it's usually a little less dangerous. We're more likely to keep women in the domestic sphere for two things. One, biologically, women are the ones feeding the children. We are the ones producing breast milk for babies. So it makes sense to keep us near the babies. The other thing, and this is where I warn you, that in no way am I trying to say men are not important. I think men are very important to our society as a whole. I'm like, let me give you that warning. That's not what I'm trying to say. But biologically, and historically, many societies of humans have viewed men as more expendable than women. And it may not be conscious, but the reason why is females are the ones that can create and carry babies, and males cannot. And so when you are trying to make more babies, you need as many women as possible because that's how many babies you can make. Genetics aside, because we need diversity, you could have one man impregnate 10 women, and then you still have 10 babies. You don't need 10 men to make 10 babies. So that is why men tend to do the more dangerous things. It does not mean that as a society we did not care about them individually. It is not saying that they were callous and saying, ah, we don't care about men, who cares? Not what they were saying, but that if you're trying to grow your species, you need more women than men. So that's where I say, please don't think I'm trying to be like, men are expendable. No, they're wonderful. We need them. But that is why we have a tendency to have them doing the more dangerous things historically. Stereotypes we've talked about before. So gender stereotypes are oversimplified, strongly held views about the characteristics of males and females. Something that I will bring up a little bit on the upcoming slides is gender stratification. That is the unequal distribution of social resources between men and women. Gender stratification refers to when one gender has more or better access to resources than the other genders. So, a great example in our own country. 1974, which to me feels like it wasn't that long ago. I wasn't here in 1974, but that feels like not that long ago. I'm aware that's 51 years ago. I know. But 51 years is not a long time for what I'm about to tell you. 1974 was when, in the United States, legally, finally, a woman could have her own bank account. Pre-1974, if you were a woman and wanted a bank account, you had to have either your husband or your father, or it could be a brother, but usually husband or father, on the bank account with you. Likewise, it wasn't until 1975 that women could apply for mortgages by themselves. So, pre-1974, if you were a woman who maybe was in a very, very bad marriage, let's say very abusive, and you needed to get out, before 1974, how would you get your finances out? Because you wouldn't be able to have a bank account without your husband on it. Or you would have to, even if you're in your 40s, go to your dad to say, can you sign on a bank account with me? So that's what we're talking about of unequal access. That wasn't a huge thing, but it does have a lot of lasting repercussions. I want to take a moment to mention gender reveal parties. I I have a love-hate relationship with them. So I don't have kids. I'm not having kids. So I'm not going to try to say I know what it's like to be expecting a baby. But I do understand wanting to celebrate that new life coming into the world. That I say, go for it. Absolutely. I get that. That's a wonderful thing. But there's a couple issues with gender reveal parties. First, language. What we're actually celebrating is I saw my baby's genitals for the first time. So technically, what we're celebrating is the baby's sex because gender is something that is very personal and they're going to figure out as they age. However, I understand that sex reveal party might have a different connotation. Meaning, if I got an invite in the mail that said, come to my gender reveal party, I'd know what I was getting myself into. Versus if I got an invite in the mail that said, come to my sex reveal party, I would be a little concerned what I got invited to. Like, what? So I understand why we're using gender instead. They can also push gendered stereotypes. Oftentimes, we want to lean into the color scheme, or we want to lean into girly things if we think we're having a girl, or boyish things if we're having a boy. But we want to be careful. Little girls don't have to play with glitter. Technically, nobody should play with guns, but little boys don't have to be violent, things like that on the slide. The other warning is if you want to do a gender reveal party, be cautious. They have started wildfires before, and there is at least one incident of a woman dying at a gender reveal party. The family wanted to do an explosion of color, and rather than go to a company to make these pyrotechnics, they made them themselves. And unfortunately, what they ended up making was a homemade pipe bomb. It exploded with shrapnel into the crowd, injured a bunch of people, and one woman died. So my warning is, if you want to celebrate your unborn baby's gender, go for it. I'm not going to come out and yell at you and say you can't, but be cautious, and be safe. The other thing that's bumming me out about gender reveal parties is gender disappointment. So every few months, I see a video go viral where some couple is posting their gender reveal. And unfortunately, it usually happens when couples are having a little girl. So what happens is, leading up to it, they interview the members of the family, and everybody's saying, I hope it's a boy, I hope it's a boy, I hope it's a boy, which is fine. You're allowed to hope for one over the other. But what happens is they film the reveal, and when the reveal happens and the cloud of pink smoke happens, instead of the couple going, oh, it's a girl, and then it's celebrating, you can have a moment of like, oh, I was hoping for a boy, but yay. What I'm seeing is usually the dads getting visibly upset and angry that they're having a little girl. And while I understand being disappointed, I would caution us because those little girls are going to grow up and watch that video, especially if it went viral. It's out there on the internet now. And they're going to witness their dad being very angry that they're a little girl. And that to me bums me out because I think you don't want to see your parents upset about you before you're even here. Like, you want to see them excited and happy. Now, don't panic about reading this whole thing. If you want to follow on the slides at home, you can. But this is a little excerpt from an interview. The woman in yellow in the photo is credited with starting the gender reveal craze in the US. And oh my gosh, you saw somebody get dumped. I just saw the chat. Somebody got dumped because of a gender reveal party. Yeah, that's extreme. That's very extreme. Yeah. I'm not gonna lie, I watched those videos, but I'm like, ooh, that's rough. So this lady wanted to celebrate her unborn baby, the little girl in the center with short blonde hair. And she says a couple things, like a lot of people who go viral. She didn't expect it to be a big thing. So she feels a little weird of like, oh, I just thought this was going to be a me thing and now it's a huge trend. But she also says, be cautious of pushing those stereotypes because for her little girl, she had tons of pink stuff. When she got ready, once she knew it was going to be a little girl, she bought her all sorts of frilly dresses and expected her to have long hair and bows and everything. And as this little girl is aging, she loves the color blue, she loves rocking a suit, and she loves having short hair. And so this mom is basically just saying, like, it's okay if you want to lean into the color scheme for the gender reveal party, but make sure you're letting your kid be an individual. As they grow, as they age, let them explore their identity. And it's okay if they don't fit into that little gender stereotype box we made for them. Nowadays, we usually think pink is for girls and blue is for boys, but that wasn't always the case. In the 18th century, Western styles for children were pretty much the same for boys and girls up until the 1910s. So all babies and toddlers were dressed mostly in white and in dresses. So even little boys were wearing dresses. That is why if you go to a christening nowadays, even though we're in 2025, a lot of times for christenings, little boys will have a gown because it's going back to this history. We started to see some differences where up until the 1910s, pink was for boys and blue was for girls, or at least it was less emphasis on who blue was for, but pink was for little boys. That started to change in the 20s. It's really hard from my research. So far, most historians are saying it's really difficult to pinpoint an exact moment when the US and Western Europe said, okay, pink is for girls and no longer for boys. Hard to figure out exactly when, but we know post World War II, it was now switched. Blue was for boys and pink was for girls. There are a few different theories as to why. I'll give you one in a moment. But we do know that this was really cemented in the 1980s, most likely because that is when we invented the sonograms to be able to see the baby's genitals. Pre-1980s, you didn't know. Now, there were tons of what we'd call like old wives' tales or folk traditions that would say something like, oh, you're carrying your baby very low. Odds are it's going to be a little boy. Sometimes they were correct, sometimes they weren't, but it was kind of a guessing game. Into the 1980s, suddenly we had the technology to know if you were having a male or female baby, for the most part. This gave new parents the opportunity to prep how they wanted to decorate their nursery. And a lot of parents leaned into pink for girls, blue for boys. This is one of the theories as to why. These paintings are technically from 1794. They depict a little girl, Pinky, and a little boy, the blue boy. The paintings did well when they came out. It basically depicts very young children, but dressed as adults, not like in a provocative way, but just dressed as adults would dress in 1794. So they were very mature, but still very childlike. Now, what happened is in the early 1900s, these paintings got reproduced and people started buying them for their homes, especially post World War II. So basically, the theory is people were buying them and thinking, these are paintings of kids. I want to use them for my children's bedroom. Then because it's the centerpiece of the room, they coordinate the decorating around the painting. So what happens is little girls got pinky, and therefore their rooms were predominantly pink. Little boys got the blue boy, so they got blue rooms. And that trend continued. Most likely, there was no one event where all of our culture sat down and said blue is for boys, pink is for girls. It was probably a bunch of different things all happening at once, overlapping, and eventually now we're very decided. Um, I I have worked odd jobs before where I've worked like retail or food, and the amount of times, like if you were, let's say you're working at like a frozen yogurt stand, and you will try to give a grown man a pink spoon, and they will, not all of them. Sorry, I was not trying to say every man. But I have had grown men throw basically temper tantrums, refusing to use something that is pink, which blows my mind because I'm like, the pink spoon is not going to turn you into a woman. It's not going to turn you gay. It's just a spoon. But some people get very, very particular about the colors for their gender. Sorry, I was checking time in my head. So gender stratification is the unequal access to resources. We see the stratification decrease when men and women make equal contributions to subsistence. So when we have men and women, which we're still kind of stuck in the binary, but when we're looking at men and women and they are making equal contributions to society or to the family, we see a decrease in gender stratification. When only one gender is the only breadwinner or is the only one in control of the money. So look back again at bank accounts. Even if, say, it's 1965 and you have a heterosexual couple and both are working full-time jobs, they're still jointly controlling their money. Or he could own his own bank account, but she could not. So even though for the most part couples were still being pretty equal, throughout the society we see unequal access. The domestic public dichotomy refers to how, and I think I may have messed this up on this slide. Yeah, I just worded this terribly, so I'm sorry for that. Um, in fact, excuse me, busting out my phone for a second. I'm going to take a picture so I remember to fix that slide for next time. But let me reword this. The domestic public dichotomy refers to we have a tendency to value work outside the home higher than work inside the home. So, for instance, when we are talking to, we see it mostly with women, moms, especially moms, where you're talking to a woman and she's a mom and she's married to a man. And you say, well, what do you do for a living? We are asking, how do you make money? Versus some women want to be stay-at-home moms. And so they don't have an outside job. They're still working, in my opinion. They're raising kids, they're cleaning, they're cooking. That's a lot of work. They're just not earning a paycheck for it. And sometimes in our society, we have a tendency to value that less versus we want to know who's bringing in the money and what do they do for a living. We even see it with our language shifting more towards women and men. So, versus if you are a dad and you have a job, our society usually does not call you anything differently. We just call you a dad with a job. Versus if you're a mom with a job, we call you a working mom because the expectation is, of course, you're a mom, you're a woman, that's your job. Oh, you also have a job? Look at you. It's weird with the language we use. I know that was very condescending. That's how I hear it. It's weird how we use that language to denote the difference of a working mother versus a stay-at-home mom. And a lot of times, unfortunately, many people in our society will value stay-at-home moms less Versus, like I said, this is as someone who is not a mom. That is work. That is a lot of work. That's more work than I do, probably. Now, I'm going to get into matriarchies and patriarchies. You've probably heard of the patriarchy before when we're talking about our own society, but we're going to look at the differences between the two. They are not exact opposites of each other, and I know that's a little confusing. In matriarchies, we usually see matrilineal descent. This is when we trace our heritage through women only. What that looks like is if I lived in a matriarchy and you asked me, Stephanie, what's your heritage? I would rattle off my mother's heritage and I would say, oh, well, there's Dutch and German and Scottish and I think a little bit of Irish and probably some Native American, but we're looking into it. And I would just leave off my dad's side of the family. Versus when, sorry, I have a message. I'm gonna respond to someone real quick. Sorry, I can't do two things at once. Oh, she's not. So, just kidding. I've got to email someone. So, it's the only drawback with online teaching is it's hard for me to do a chat and talk at the same time, as you can tell, as I get really tongue-tied. So, note for later. Continue on, Stephanie. So, anyways, matrilineal descent would be tracing it only through my mom's side, versus most like Americans, we trace both sides of the family. Matrilocal is located at or centered around the residence of the women's family or people. So, in a matrilineal society, you would live with your parents, but your mother owns the property and she inherited it from her mother. And when I grow up and I take a husband, he would come live with me and my family. Versus in a patrilineal society, I would go live with him and his father or his father's property. In matriarchies, what's interesting is you typically find infrequent warfare and less population pressure, meaning patriarchies will oftentimes be focused on growing the population, having as many kids as possible, versus a matriarchy is usually more on let's just be the best society we can. Obviously, we want to have kids to continue our society, but we're not pressuring women to have as many kids as possible. We're just going to let them have as many kids as they want. The infrequent warfare is tricky because in no way am I trying to say that men are biologically more violent or aggressive. But frequently in matriarchies, and I think partially because they're usually smaller population size, they're less focused on land grabs. They're less focused on violence being their go-to answer. They're usually a little more diplomatic and will try to have like conversations rather than fights. In the animal kingdom, a great example are bonobos. So, bonobos used to be called pygmy chimpanzees because we thought they were a subspecies of chimpanzees. We now know that they are their own species. They are our closest living relatives. The two groups they are closely related to are humans and, of course, chimpanzees. So, they are matriarchies. What is fascinating is chimpanzee groups are usually male-led. Chimpanzee groups turn to warfare pretty quickly. That's not to say they're all violent, but when they have disagreements within their troop or between two troops, they'll usually duke it out. They'll fight. Versus bonobos have two main ways that they will go to first. If there's a disagreement between two bonobos, they will suggest either food, like pictured here, or sex. And I am not kidding. That is how they try to end disagreements. Now, that doesn't mean they never ever have warfare. It does happen. There is violence that happens, but they usually, on average, will try to avoid that. Now, I'm not saying the sex is a good solution, but sometimes when I watch like our Congress or Senate and they're yelling at each other, I have a moment where I think, has everyone eaten? Maybe if we all had a charcuterie board and had a snack, we'd be nicer to each other. I don't know, maybe not, but sometimes I think that we need to take a page from the bonobos. So a matriarchy is a society in which women hold higher status than men, and they play a more prominent role in politics. So where it can be a little confusing is just because a government elects a female leader does not automatically make them a matriarchy. So, for example, in New Zealand, one of their former prime ministers, pictured here, was Jacinda Ardern. When she was elected, that did not make them a matriarchy. Similarly, in our own country at the last presidential election, we were deciding basically between Trump and Harris. If Kamala Harris had won, that would have been groundbreaking, but it would not have automatically made us a matriarchy. Now, I'm not saying we have to be a matriarchy, but if we wanted to be, there would be a lot more steps in play and a lot more things we have to get through first before we could say, okay, we are a true matriarchy. You get to hear me mispronounce words again, but a true matriarchy, for example, would be the Minangkabau of West Sumatra in Indonesia. Here, land inheritance is passed from mother to daughter. They are matrilocal and matrilineal. When a couple gets married in a lot of small scale patriarchies, the groom's wedding party, so his groomsmen, his family, travel to the bride's family's house and get her and then bring her to the wedding ceremony. With the Minangkabau, it's the exact opposite. The woman's family goes to the groom's house, which is his mother's house, and gets him for the ceremony. In the event of a divorce, the husband simply takes his stuff and goes back to live with his mother. And it's not in a chastising, like, haha, you live with your mom way. It's just that's where he lives, unless he's married and then he lives in her house. It's just how they operate. Now, I will bring this up in a couple weeks when I talk about marriage and kinship. A lot of times in our country, people will say the divorce rate is too high. We need to lower the divorce rate. And on one hand, I understand we don't want to think of marriages ending all the time. And we don't, a lot of people say they don't want marriage to be something that you jump into. They want it to have more forethought. So we don't want divorce as an option because we want people to be absolutely sure. The problem is, my understanding is that a healthy society needs to have divorce as an option. It doesn't mean everybody has to get a divorce. It doesn't mean it has to be like every other day you're getting a divorce, stuff like that. But it needs to be an option because sometimes people lie. Sometimes you think you're marrying one person and then they show their true colors after you're married. Sometimes people cheat. Sometimes a couple just runs its course and nobody cheats, nobody lies, but you just both collectively decide this isn't what we want anymore. We need to be able to say, hey, this is done, I'm moving on. And it helps us to kind of keep a healthy society. So if that's a matriarchy, what's a patriarchy? Where it's a little different is a matriarchy isn't necessarily ruled by women, but that women hold a higher status versus patriarchies in anthropology are political systems ruled by men in which the main goal is to have unequal rights and unequal access. The United States is a great example of a patriarchy. We are patrilineal and patrilocal. Yes, like I said, most of us will trace our lineage through both families. But think of it this way. How common is it that most of us right now are sitting here with our father's last name? And if we think of, okay, well, but I know my mother's last name, her maiden name, that is probably her father's last name. And that continues on back through the generations. So that is where we have that remnants of patrilineality. Yes, I trace my heritage through both parents, but I have my father's last name. We're patrilocal. Like I said, it wasn't until 1975 that a woman could get a mortgage by herself. So most of our property through most of our history has been owned either jointly or just by men. And if we look at our politics in our population, looking only at the binary, men make up 49% of the population. But are 75% of the US Senate, 77% of the US House of Representatives, 71% of statewide elected executives, 78% of mayors in cities with populations over 30,000, 100% of presidents, and 98% of vice presidents. So, if you want to know where I got those numbers, they're linked on the bottom of the slide. You do not have to memorize those statistics. I'm not going to quiz you on like what percentage of the US House of Representatives are men. Not what I'm quizzing you on. But it's just to kind of break down how we can see throughout our short country's history how much it's been dominated by men. And the reason why I added the 98% of vice presidents is lover or hater, I am not trying to get political in the sense that we're going to talk about Kamala Harris and her politics. Whether or not you liked her, it was groundbreaking that we got our first female vice president. So yeah, there's been a lot of presidents that are groundbreaking that I didn't really agree with, but I could still notice like, yeah, that was a big history moment. Within patriarchies, we see the patrilineal patrilocal complex. This is when male supremacy is continued based on patrilineality, patrilocality, and warfare. So, not trying to say that every single patriarchy is violent and aggressive, but unfortunately, many patriarchies, from the anthropological standpoint, are focused on male supremacy. So, with a matriarchy, women may have higher esteem and they may be more likely to hold positions of power, but men still have equal rights. They still have human rights. They can still, vote, own property can be a little confusing because if it's a small enough society, that's not going to be like it is here, but they can still have rights. Versus it's very frequent in patriarchies that they are trying to keep women or other genders down, limit their rights, limit their access to resources. And we see it where we see in these societies, frequently we find increased warfare, increased male superiority, and scarce resources with more competition. One way we see the control is using violence against women. Kotak explains patriarchy describes a political system ruled by men in which women have inferior social and political status, including basic human rights. So I'm I know I'm trying to remember. It's Pakistan. Um, what I'm going to get into is a few of the ways that violence has been used to keep women down, to limit their rights, to limit their control and their access. Um, Again, I don't want you to think I'm trying to say that because violence is often used in patriarchies, that therefore all men are violent or that men are just naturally inclined to violence. Not what I'm trying to say. But unfortunately, what we're looking at is centuries, if not millennia, of a history of men being in power and feeling threatened, so they use violence to maintain that power. Where we see that is, for example, dowry murders. I'll get into dowries in a few weeks, but basically, it's a substantial gift given from the bride's family to the groom's. And India is an area where we see this, where dowry murders have happened, where they basically get married, collect the dowry, and then kill her off. They get to keep the dowry and are now free to remarry and do it again. It's just using them for riches. We also historically have seen female infanticide, which is the murder of female babies. If you have a country, China did this, I'll bring this up again in family and marriage. For like 30 years, China had the one child rule where every family was allowed one child. And if you had more than one, you were fined, which of course disproportionately affected poor families. Your families, your extended family, was putting a lot of pressure on you to have a little boy because they're a patriarchy and boys are valued more than girls. So you have all this pressure to have a little boy, and then you have a little girl. It wasn't so common that it was everybody, but occasionally some families would kill that little girl so that they could try again to have a little boy. Now, the good news is even more little girls were just given up for adoption and were adopted out to other families. We'll get into it, but there was infanticide. And then what I'm going to describe on the next slide, I'm not going to get graphic because I'm not here to gross you out or make you uncomfortable, but I'm going to explain what a clitoridectomy is, or sometimes called female genital mutilation. Now, if you want to know how much this violence can go, Malala Yousafzai on the screen, I believe she is Pakistani, but my brain is like, I'm second guessing myself. I think she's Pakistani. She was an advocate for women's education back in like 2011, and she had a blog and she was internationally known. At this time, the Taliban was in control and did not want girls to be educated. She was speaking out against them, saying, I have the right to an education. They took over her school bus and shot her in the head and the shoulder. They shot a couple other girls. I think they survived. She survived partially because she was already an internationally known person. We collectively were able to get her good medical care right away. Without that, she probably would have died. So she is still alive and well. She has graduated, I think, with her master's. She is still a very outspoken advocate for women's rights and education. So really amazing lady. So to explain clitoridectomy slash, okay, it has like 8 different names, I swear. I've heard it called clitoridectomy, female genital cutting, female genital mutilation, and female circumcision. They're all referring to the same thing. So the reason why this practice still exists is within Arab and Muslim countries and cultures, they place a lot of emphasis on family honor. And it is usually tied to the purity of the women in that family. And yes, by purity, we mean sexual intercourse. So keeping them virgins until marriage is deemed very, very important for the entire family's honor. One of the other books I'll use in a couple weeks, by the author Galanti, tells an anecdote of an Arab couple in a hospital where the husband was saying no men can come into the hospital room. He said his wife was indisposed, she was very vulnerable, it was not okay. And where I say I like that they worked with him rather than against him, they could have just yelled at him and argued with him and said, no, that's stupid, let us in. But they didn't. They found a workaround. Was it ideal? No, but it worked. They basically said, okay, we only have a male nurse on staff and we have to draw her blood. So we can't just wait. Let's cover her in a blanket with only her arms sticking out. The male nurse will come in, draw her blood as quickly as possible, get out, you can go back to being comfy. And they were both okay with this. Is it a little bit of an extra step for the nursing community, or the nursing staff? Yeah, but it was a way to work with him and her. So this is where I say this might be jarring, but like I said, I'm not trying to be graphic or gross or anything like that. But to explain what this procedure is, it is very commonly performed on young girls, like around 12 years old. It is very scary because a lot of them are not told what is going to happen. This is performed without anesthesia, oftentimes, not in sterile environments, which can lead to infections. It is both physically and emotionally traumatic. Where I'm not going to get graphic, but to explain, it's going to depend on the culture, how extreme it gets. But in extreme circumstances, they will surgically remove the clitoris and sew up the vaginal opening to a very, very small opening. The idea is if we make sexual intercourse painful and or not fun, it will keep them from having sex before marriage. Because again, the idea is a woman having sex before marriage makes her entire family and lineage impure and unworthy. So it's somehow now the entire family's job to keep this 12-year-old girl pure. So the idea is we're going to make sex painful and not fun. She won't want to do it. Now, does it work? Yeah, a lot of them are like, I don't want to have sex. The problem is when they get married, it's expected they will have sex. So now, when they finally do have intercourse, it's incredibly painful, very traumatic, and giving birth is even harder. So, this does not mean every Arab person or Muslim person you meet believes in this or has had this performed on them or anything like that. There is a large community that is against this practice. Me, personally, I don't like it. I know, though, that one, I do not have the power to just go stop it. And even if I did have the power to go in to these countries and make it illegal, I also know from our own history, making something illegal doesn't make it go away. It just makes it less safe. Look at the prohibition of alcohol. We tried to make alcohol completely illegal, and instead, what we did was boost the mafia because they recognized, oh, we can make a lot of money because people love alcohol. So, if we just say you can't perform this procedure anymore, would some stop? Yeah. But a lot of them would just be done in less sterile environments or with less medical professionals present. And that's even more dangerous. So I would argue, while yes, I would love to make this practice go away, I can't do that, but I can advocate for if they're going to practice it, let's talk to the little girls ahead of time, give them a heads up. Let's use anesthesia. Let's do this in a sterile environment to minimize infection. Let's be as careful and gentle as we can be. Personally, I still don't think that's a great solution, but it's steps in the right direction. The example I have at the bottom, which unfortunately I still hear about. Um, Okay, so for those of you that have never given birth but plan on it, I am so sorry to be the one to tell you, but if you give birth naturally, it is very common that you will tear down there. So if you tear, the good news is you can heal. It's been going on for millennia. We will stitch you up so you heal properly. That's somewhat common. But where I still hear the joke made is a male doctor turning to the father or husband, father of the baby or husband of the woman who gave birth, and saying, "Hey, when I stitch her up, do you want me to add an extra stitch so that it's extra tight for you?" Not talking to her, not asking her, just asking her spouse if he wants it. So we still see that as a common joke within our country. I'm hoping it's dying out, but I still hear it kind of joked about and talked about in society. So I know that's not a fun topic, but we're done talking about it now. And we'll talk a little bit about industrial societies. So within industrial societies, the economic roles of men and women have definitely changed over time. Industrialization, meaning like tons of booming factories, lead to a lot of women entering the workforce. So we're looking at early 1900s in the US. And suddenly, cities like Chicago, New York are booming with big, big factories. And they need workers for these factories. Now, the factories are backbreaking, dangerous work, terrible working conditions, long hours, and crap pay. So a lot of the men in those cities know I can get a better paying job and an easier job elsewhere. Everybody's hiring. And so the women end up taking the factory jobs because they're the ones that are like, I need any kind of income. I can't have a bank account. Can't own property, but I can at least have a little income. This led to a lot of independence. This was also around the fight for women's suffrage, getting the right to vote in the US and like England. So you had a lot of women being very independent for the time, making their own money, living in boarding houses rather than with their family, and staying single longer because they have a little more economic freedom. And this was deemed very threatening to the menfolk of the time because they were seeing, oh, we've kept them under our thumb because we control the resources. Now that they're having their own income, oh, this is dangerous. So this is when we saw the push towards the saying, a woman's place is in the house. Basically, trying to tell women it's their natural desire to be in domestic spheres versus, what most of the women were saying were like, no, that's not the natural state. That's just where we've been for the last few centuries. We'd like to branch out a little bit. And I say most of the women because just like today, there are going to be women that say, no, I like the way the system is working. I don't want it to change. I think my favorite argument, I say favorite because I hear it too often, is I'll be talking to a young woman or my age who's married to a man. And she says, I literally had this conversation with a friend. We were talking, and she said, "Ugh, I hate feminism." And I said, "What? Why?" And she goes, "Because of feminism, I have to work for a living." And I said, no, that's not what feminism did and does. I'm like, feminism, the feminist movement, is saying, if you want to have a job outside of your home and you want to earn a living outside of your husband's living, you have the right to do that. If you want to stay home and be a stay-at-home mom or wife, you also have the right to do that. But we're just saying it's your right to choose which route you want to go. So that was my joke with her is I was like, you're not mad at feminism. You're mad at the economy. The reason why you can't be a stay-at-home mom is because the living wage hasn't increased in years. Your husband just doesn't make enough, and it's not his fault either. So it was just kind of a funny moment of like, oh, I know you're right to be upset. If you want to be a stay-at-home mom, that'd be great, but yeah, it's the economy. Now, even today, there are fields dominated by men and fields dominated by women. What's frustrating is when you have a field dominated by women and men start to enter it, they usually bring with them better pay and a little bit more respect. So look at nursing. Nursing for years was dominated by women. And I think it still technically is dominated by women, but we have a lot more male nurses. When male nurses started becoming more common, it was so new that the United States, at least, created a new term for them and called them nurses, like nurse with an M. Because we were so like, well, I was not expecting a man to do this role. But nursing career, while still, in my opinion, underappreciated, is a little better respected nowadays with a little better pay. Versus when women start entering a male-dominated career field, they're usually not seen as a welcome sign. They're paid less and they can experience sexual harassment and unsafe conditions. Now, again, in no way am I trying to say that men never face sexual harassment. They definitely do. But unfortunately, statistically, women are going to face it more often and especially in male-dominated fields. To tie in my own research, I just spend one slide on it. But I've mentioned how my research focused on women truck drivers. And most of us, if we envision a truck driver, we think of a man. And that's statistically correct because what, 92% are men, 7.9% are women. And that is up since 2014. So now that it's 2025, I'll probably have updated numbers. So it'll probably be even higher. What's interesting is when we look at truck driving, there's two different types. There's long haul and short haul. Long haul is I'm going to drive from New York to California. I'm going to spend multiple days over the road. I'm going to sleep in my truck. I'll probably shower at a truck stop. I'll eat most of my meals out, and I'll be home in a few days. Short haul is I go to the same place every morning, I load up my truck, and then I go around the state, but I'm home every night. What's interesting is because even in our country today, women are still expected to be the primary caregivers. Um, they disproportionately pick short haul. So I'll use my aunt as an example. When she was a trucker, she had a young kid. My cousin was in school, but he was still pretty young. And she chose short haul because she wanted to be home at night. She wanted to cook him dinner. She wanted to tuck him in, help with his homework, stuff like that. Now, that is not trying to say that anyone that chooses long haul, or men in particular, are distant parents and don't care, but just that we're seeing more women gravitate towards the short haul route option. The career offers a lot of freedom. Sometimes you can work your way up to being your own boss. A lot of people love that. And it does give you a little bit of freedom. I think one of my favorite sayings of one of the women I interviewed said, I love my job. My office window changes every day. Meaning for some of us, like me sitting in this office, my view out the window is never going to change. I mean, it might change a little, like somebody could get pulled over on the street. That's different, but the buildings aren't going to change. Versus them, they're like, today I'm driving through Montana, tomorrow, Texas, all over the place. But they have to be cautious of sexual harassment. Sometimes it is violent threats and harassment, where I have heard stories of men trying to break into their cab while they're sleeping. And thankfully, they never got in, so they never found out what they wanted, but you don't want to find out the hard way. And sometimes it's microaggressions, like a woman trucker pulling up to a truck stop to fill up her tank. And she hops out of the truck like she's done a million times. And some other male trucker does the microaggression of, oh, do you need help? Where's your husband? Where's your boyfriend? Where's your partner? Expecting them to be driving with a man because clearly a woman can't pump gas. Now, to be fair, I've never pumped gas in a semi truck. But my understanding is the same basic concept applies. And these women who are driving the trucks, they've filled up many times. They know what they're doing. Now, our ideas around the relationship between work and family have also changed. If you ever want a laugh slash to be annoyed, look up 1950s sexist advertisements. This one isn't even bad. There are some of the 50s and 60s into the 70s that are just bad, where they're basically making the housewife look like an idiot. So, like, this one isn't terrible, but he's basically saying, like, oh, I can still drink my beer because you didn't mess that up. Also, beer is not an appropriate dinner, friends. So, when we look at the housewife and family and the housewife, I could technically spend all day talking to you about TV, but I won't. I will just introduce you to two housewives from the 50s and two from the 80s. To be fair, I would like to get some updated from the 2020s, but I'll be honest, I'm not a big sitcom junkie. Like a family sitcom, not really my jam. So I'll have to explore to get some options. But in the 50s, TV started to be the new big thing. It started to be in almost every house. And people were watching different shows about family life. On the bottom left is Leave It to Beaver. The child in the photo is nicknamed Beaver, last name Cleaver. I'm not 100% sure why this child was nicknamed Beaver. It did not have the like sexual implications it does now. I think he just had buck teeth and the kids called him Beaver. But anyways, his mother is the main goal of this, June Cleaver. June Cleaver was a character who was always perfect. Her hair was beautifully coiffed. She had makeup on, not too much, but just nice makeup, jewelry, pressed dress. Her house was always perfect. She home cooked every meal. And for a lot of American moms, it was unattainable. They would make jokes when they burnt dinner, like, sorry, I'm not June Cleaver, because they knew, like, this is unattainable. This is fake. Now, she also had good parenting moments talking to her children, to her husband, things like that. But she mostly just kind of lived in the kitchen. Versus the I Love Lucy show, we have Lucille Ball, who I think is a comedic genius. Also, shout out to the I Love Lucy show for having an interracial couple in the 1950s. That was groundbreaking. But Lucy was a little more attainable. Yeah, she was also beautiful and funny and ran her house, but she made mistakes. She forgot to plug things in. She burnt dinner. She would occasionally get a job outside of the home, and she'd mess it up because that's the humor. But at the end of the show, we still loved her, and we were still like, yeah, that's a little more realistic. I also make mistakes. Jump to the 1980s. The, I'm laughing because unfortunately, people related to these images, in my opinion, are kind of not great people, specifically thinking of Bill Cosby. But the Cosby Show in the 80s was amazing. And it was a great family. And it was groundbreaking in the sense that, it followed a well-to-do Black family in America. But is her first name Claire Huxtable? I think it's Claire, Ms. Huxtable here. She was a working mom. I believe she was a lawyer. She also made mistakes. Again, that's how the humor comes in sitcoms. But for the most part, she was pretty well poised and ran her house as well as a high-powered career. Some American women similarly thought that was a little unattainable. Others saw themselves in her and, loved her dearly. The Roseanne show was Roseanne Barr. And her husband, white family, they worked blue collar jobs. I believe Roseanne worked in a factory. So she was in a male dominated field, blue collar. They were crass, they cursed, they fought. And I'm not saying they were perfect parents by any means, But a lot of Americans said, ah, that's more realistic because a lot of our families aren't perfect. And sometimes we curse and sometimes we break things and get in arguments. And it shows a little realistic snapshot of life. Now, 46% of Americans state that work has interfered with family rather than the other way around. Meaning, if they have two events at the same time, a meeting with their boss and a kid's soccer game, 46%, almost half of Americans would say, obviously, I'm going to the meeting and I'll miss the soccer game, rather than saying, I'll miss the meeting, I need to go to the soccer game. 40% of women and mothers are now the primary source of income for families. We are still seeing inequality among the sexes in our country. Some of the barriers include the gendered pay gap. Statistically, women make less than men. I will kind of explain that on the next slide a little bit. Um, that is keeping us back. Stereotypes around men and women. So, yes, we have stereotypes that obviously sound harmful, but we also have stereotypes that sound like a good thing. We have a tendency to stereotype women as just naturally better at domestic chores. There is nothing biological that makes women better at domestic chores like cleaning and cooking and raising children. The reason why we see women doing it more often and usually doing a good job, not always, but it's because that's how we were raised. When we're little girls, if we are raised as little girls, we oftentimes want to do what our moms are doing. And historically, that has been domestic chores. We can even see it in the toys we buy kids. Think of what you buy little boys, trucks, action figures. Little girls, you buy them babies, you buy them kitchen sets. Now in 2025, I'm loving seeing children of all genders playing with all toys. I love that. But I'll admit my little feminist moment when my best friend had a little girl, because she has four kids. So when she had her first little boy and then she had her next little girl, one of the things I bought her kid when she was a toddler was a play doctor set because I knew that some of the older relatives were going to buy her things like baby dolls and kitchen sets. And I'm not saying you're not allowed to play with them, but I was like, I'm going to buy her a doctor set. So we'll see. She's 14. Who knows what she's going to turn out to be? But when we say women are inherently good at domestic tasks, we're saying men are inherently bad, which, again, a lot of times the reason why they're bad is because they weren't raised doing it. But they have the mental and physical capacities to do a good job. Some men, again, not all, some men will use that stereotype to their advantage and do a bad job at cooking and cleaning as a way to say, oh, I just shouldn't even do it at all. No, we're all capable adults. We can figure it out. So, on average, women make 81% of what their male peers make, meaning 81 cents per dollar. Now, it gets even worse and more specific if we look at ethnic groups of women of color, where Black women make less than white women, and so forth. So increasingly, America's poorest are women and their children. Kotak offers a suggestion. He says women should organize. And I think that's a great idea. I'm not saying that's wrong, but I have a few ideas on the next slide. Now, my warning to you is the next slide is 100% your professor's opinion. You do not have to agree with me. This is just my opinion. Things that I think would help the disparity between what men and women are earning. One, raise the minimum wage to something actually livable. If we go by 1950 standards, the idea was if you are paid by the federal minimum wage and work 40 hours a week, you should be able to support yourself, a spouse, and about two kids. meaning you would need a property with at least two bedrooms. The federal minimum wage is less than $8 an hour, and there is nowhere in the US, any of the US, that you can work a full-time federally minimum wage job and afford a two-bedroom apartment, let alone owning your own property, which means both spouses have to work. And if both spouses are working, you would want them to be paid comparably, not 81 cents to the dollar. I also think paid parental leave would be helpful. We do not have federally mandated parental leave, meaning maternity or paternity. I would argue, regardless of gender, if you bring a baby or a kid into this world, you should get some time off to spend with them. Some people who don't have kids say it's not fair. I would argue, especially if we're talking a newborn baby, have you ever been around a newborn baby? That is not going to be vacation. They're going to be working probably harder than I am. Babies are a lot of work. Sick days in addition to paid time off. If, okay, so it's going to depend on your company. A lot of companies will give you paid time off, vacation time, but they won't give you sick time. Meaning, if you are sick, you have to use a vacation day, which for a lot of us, if we're sick for 1 or 2 days, yeah, that sucks. I'd rather use my time for vacation, but whatever. But if you're a parent, you're going to use up all your vacation time because kids get sick really easily. And if your kid is homesick, you have to be homesick. And lastly, affordable childcare. Again, I don't have kids, but all I know is childcare is ridiculously expensive. Same best friend with four kids. Their two youngest, they're now in school, but when they first had them, they're about like a year and a half, 2 years apart. So for a while, they had a toddler and a newborn. My best friend had always wanted to be a stay-at-home mom, but was working full time at a bank. Now, lucky for her, she hated that job. And the reason why I say lucky is her and her husband sat down and calculated the cost for full-time daycare for a toddler and an infant. And it was costing a year almost the exact same amount as what she was bringing home after taxes, which is depressing. Because if you're a single parent, that's your entire salary. So luckily for her, her and her husband sat down and said, "Hey, this is stupid. You're working a job you hate to earn money to turn around and pay for childcare while you work the job you hate." So they decided she quit her job. And for like 5 years until they went into school, she was a stay-at-home mom. She loved it. Now she has a job because they're in school and she loves that. So it was great for her, but it was depressing to me to learn that the cost of two children in childcare was about the same as what you'd make at a full-time job. Like that's too much. Sorry, I looked at my clock. It's 7:33. I thought it was 7:53, and I was like, "Oh my God, I did not get as far as I thought." But no, we're good. We're plugging along. We're making progress. Okay, so a couple of slides. I want to talk about the additional article by Martin. It is called The Egg and the Sperm: How Science Has Constructed a Romance Based on Stereotypical Male-Female Roles. This was published by Dr. Emily Martin in 1991. So it is an older article. But basically, what she's talking about is language is important. And we need to be cautious of how we talk about our reproductive organs. For a lot of our history, when we talk about human reproduction, we have a tendency to refer to sperm as very positive language and eggs maybe not as negative language, but as more passive language. And sperm is considered the active participant in this fusion. Sperm is celebrated often because it is continuously produced versus Eggs are devalued as inferior because production is finished at birth. Now, in the 30 some years since this has been published, we are starting to find more evidence that that might not be correct, that we might have the ability to create some more eggs as we grow. But for the most part, when female humans are born, we are born with as many eggs as we will produce. Meaning, if you are female, the eggs you are carrying existed within your mother while you were in utero, which means this is where I get woo-woo for a second because I think it's cool. We all existed not only within our mothers, but within our grandmothers, which to me is just fascinating. Um, but I want to be cautious. Did we exist? Not really. Was our consciousness there? No. Did half of the zygote that turned into us exist? Yes. In these papers, sperm is often seen as streamlined and active, versus eggs are seen as large and passive, lying in wait for the active agent. As Martin says, the wording stresses the fragility and dependency of the egg, even though the same text acknowledges elsewhere that sperm also live for only a few hours. Now, excuse me. I like that quote because it's interesting to show the hypocrisy. However, again, with evidence being updated, we now also are figuring out that sperm live longer than we originally thought, which is why we invented things like Plan B. Again, don't worry, I'm not going to make you debate whether or not you agree with Plan B, but it exists because sperm can survive longer than we originally thought outside of the testicles. So that's why we have to be cautious. But both of these things are expendable, and we still historically have used language that makes it sound like sperm is better than eggs or more valuable. Martin complains that even when language is switched up, we still use very aggressive language. So, language that we have used is that the sperm hunts the egg, the sperm attacks the eggs, impregnates the egg, spears the eggs. But even if we switch it, now we're saying things like the egg harpoons the sperm, lassos it in, and it's still very, very aggressive. And Martin kind of argues like maybe rather than the egg or the sperm being an active agent with a personality and aggression, maybe we should use language about partnerships. Like rather than saying one spears the other, maybe we should talk about how the egg and the sperm build a bridge together and then unite and talk about it as a union. That is a little nicer, in my opinion. It's not putting emphasis on one over the other. Martin also warns us we need to be cautious of giving too much personhood to cellular entities. So, again, I'm trying to be cautious. I am not trying to make us have a debate around abortion or when we think the fetus becomes a human. Not going to make us debate that because I'm aware we're probably going to have a lot of disagreements here. If you want to know my personal opinion, stay after class, we'll talk. But that's not what we're here for. But the reason why she's warning us to be cautious is eggs and sperms are small, non-sentient organisms. They do not have personality. They are not us yet. Now, once they fuse and that cell division begins, then they will eventually lead to us, and we will eventually have personality and personhood and individuality. Yeah, but when we're a sperm or when we're an egg, yeah, that's not. Even if you say life begins at conception, you're still saying it doesn't exist until the sperm and egg unite. Then it turns into a fetus eventually. So looking at gender identity. And this is where it can get a little confusing, but gender identity is a person's identification by self and others as male, female, or again, something else. I know you've heard the term transgender, and this is kind of a lengthy definition. So I'll read it and then kind of explain. So, transgender is a gender identity that is socially constructed and individually performed by individuals whose gender identity contradicts their biological sex at birth and the gender identity assigned to them at infancy. So, in our own society, for example, when a baby is born, we assign it a gender, and that is usually based off their genitals. So, we expect male children with outward testicles and a penis. We say it's a boy. And if you have the other, if you have a vagina and breasts, then we say it's a girl. And usually, when a child is born, that's about as detailed as we get. Now, I'll bring up intersex people and how medical professionals get a little controlling with that. But for the most part, we kind of decide their gender right there. And then the baby is raised as such. So let's say you're born a boy, you're born biologically male, and the doctors say, congratulations, it's a boy. And your parents say, hooray, a boy. And they bring you home and they raise you as a boy with some gendered expectations. They expect you to wear pants only, maybe have short hair, play with trucks, maybe G.I. Joe. And they name you a boy name. But either later in life, or some people, even from a very young age, let's say this little boy has always felt, this doesn't fit. I'm not like other boys. In fact, I'm kind of like the other girls. I want to wear a pretty dress, and I want to play with Barbies, and I don't want to play with guns. I want to do the girly things. And that would be somebody who is trans, who is transgender. Their internal understanding of their gender identity does not line up with what their parents and the doctors said it was going to be. Versus cisgender. Cisgender are individuals who identify with the gender assigned to them at birth. So, not to tell you all my business, but to use myself as an example, I was born female. The doctor said, congratulations, it's a girl. My parents said, hooray, another girl. And they raised me as such. Now, did I go through tomboy periods? Yes. And even today, as an adult, there are some things that our society deems masculine that I enjoy. But for the most part, when I was called a little girl, I said, yeah, I'm a little girl. And then I grew up, and I won't lie, I had some soul searching moments where I kind of had to sit and talk to myself and say, are you a girl? Are you sure? And I did some soul searching, and what I came out with was, yeah, I am. No, that's right. That's correct. That's me. I would be cisgender. Now, some of the arguments around the term cis by cis people is they don't like being called cis or cisgender. And I have heard some people say it's a slur. It's not a slur. The only reason why the term cisgender exists is because we, academically and people within the trans community, were seeing language that could lead to dehumanizing trans people. So, in other words, for example, I have heard this said before, where a cis person would say, oh, even if it's supposed to be something nice, they would say something like, this is my friend, and she happens to be transgender. And I'd say, cool. And then they'd want to denote that they are not transgender. But because we didn't have a word for it, they would say something along the lines of, she's transgender and I'm normal. The reason why we wanted to get away from that is saying one gender identity is normal is saying the others are abnormal. And that feels very distancing and dehumanizing. So cisgender is not supposed to be a bad word. It's just meaning you agree with the gender assigned to you at birth. So hopefully that makes sense. I know it can be confusing, but it's not meant in a bad way. It's just an identifier. Now, where it gets confusing, I'm spending way too much time on this, but to explain, um, a lot of times people will bring up like we talked about with ethnicity and race. I talked about Rachel Dolezal pretending to be a Black person, and she identifies as transracial. And I said, that's not a thing. That is because, well, I don't want to just be like, it's complicated, but it is. It's very complicated. So this is me trying to simplify it. Racial identity and gender identity within our society, one is ascribed and one is achieved. Ascribed meaning it's not fluid. Race, racial identity is not fluid in our society. Now, I mentioned how some societies may have a little more fluidity, but especially in ours, that is not how it has rolled since the beginning of our time. We have basically said race is linked to ancestry, genetics, and historical social constructs. While gender definitely has historical social constructs, it's tied more to your individual biology and your neurology and your psychology. We, collectively, not me, as scientists, have been doing the research for decades where we have actually been able to study brain waves. And even though I say male and female humans are not so different that we can't get along, on average, female brains work a little different than male brains. It doesn't mean that, like I said, like, oh, and then that's why men are bad at domestic chores. No, but that different centers just light up differently. We have actually done studies where we have taken a trans woman who, when she was born, was assigned boy at birth, but then as an adult says, mm-mm, I'm a woman. And we have, put her in an MRI machine. And I'm not a neuroscientist, so I may be a little wrong in the general terms, but basically studied her brain waves and discovered that her brain operates like a cisgender female brain. And so it's interesting that we've got this long history of trans people always existing, but now suddenly having the conversation around it and trying to get the rest of people on board of like, no, they've always been here and they're always going to be here. We just now have the language and the science to kind of explore why and how. And I mentioned how many societies have other gender options. We are seeing in our own Western society, we are now having the discussion around non-binary people, which sometimes they will call themselves gender non-conforming, but more often I see the term non-binary, which really is just saying if the binary is man and woman, a non-binary person is saying, I don't fit in either of those categories. And sometimes they can be more specific and say, I'm non-binary, but I'm this denoted subsect. But for the most part, non-binary is just saying, I see your two-gender system and I disagree with it, and I do not fall into those categories. Some other examples outside of the binary, we have the Hijras of India. Now, for time, I'm going to skip it, but if you want to know more about the Hijra people, basically, they have a long, like 3,000-year history where they used to be religiously revered and respected. Now, unfortunately, because of colonization, much like trans women in our country, they face a lot of stigma, a lot of oppression, and violence. So unfortunately, they are very stigmatized. But Hijra women are women that were born biologically male, but grew up never quite vibing with it. And many of them undergo sexual reassignment surgery, but they don't have to. But they dress as women, but they call themselves Hijra. It is a third gender within India. I'll also kind of describe two-spirit people among Native Americans. And that is a very new term, although they've existed forever. The term itself is new. And the kind of interesting loophole is the Geg tribes of North Albania and what they call virginal transvestites. In the Western world, we don't really use the term transvestite anymore, but they still do. So basically, it's a loophole. You have a patriarchy where land and wealth is passed from father to son. But what happens if you don't have any biological sons? What happens to your property? It just goes away because you couldn't possibly give it to your daughters. Now, I would say a great solution would be to give it to your daughters and say, down with that part of the patriarchy. Let's just pass it on to our kids. Their loophole is they find one of their biological daughters and she agrees to abandon her identity and become a man. He picks up he, him pronouns, might even change his name, dresses as a man, does men's activities, and takes a wife. Now, you and I know that two biological female humans, without scientific intervention, are not going to make a baby together. So, how do these two people have a baby without medical intervention? Because now, how are they going to raise or pass their wealth on to their kids? What they do is those two, that couple agrees on a third person, a man. He also agrees because he will have sex with the wife, impregnate her. Biologically, we know those are his kids, but culturally, he has no ties with them. He might be like an uncle that checks in, but he does not say, those are my kids. They culturally agree that those kids belong to the two biological women. So it's an interesting little loophole where they find a workaround. Would we call all of those people trans? No, because that's not what they call themselves. But I can see how that could fall under like the trans identity umbrella. I mentioned intersex. This is pertaining to a group of biological conditions reflecting a discrepancy between external and internal genitals. The outdated term for this is hermaphrodite. We no longer use it for the people. We still use the term hermaphrodite when we're talking about plants and animals. But the people have basically nicely said, hey, we don't love that word. It unfortunately has a lot of bad connotation now. Can we please be called intersex? So that is our newer term. Oftentimes, when we hear, especially with the term hermaphrodite, but intersex, people will think somebody born with completely intact male and female genitalia, meaning a penis and a vagina. Does that occasionally happen? Yes, but it's way more rare. What it usually is your outside genitals don't match your inside reproductive organs. So let's say you're born a male, you have a penis and testicles, and they work, and you go through your entire adult life thinking, I'm a normal, air quotes, man. And then you have some fertility issues, or maybe you have a gallbladder issue, not even related to reproductive issues. And you go in for a sonogram or an ultrasound. And while they're in there, the doctor discovers, because you've never checked before, surprise, you also have two intact ovaries. That happens occasionally. For a lot of intersex people, they can go their entire life not knowing they're intersex. Unfortunately, when the outside genitalia does not look like what we were expecting, it is somewhat common for intersex newborn babies to undergo basically sex reassignment surgery. Rather than waiting for that little kid to grow up and make the decision themselves, the parents and the doctor decide for them how their outward genitalia should look. And I understand on one point, as parents, you don't want your kid to be bullied or feel different. You don't. But again, it's easy for me to say without kids. I would argue we should let that kid grow up until they can understand the differences and if they want surgery. Two-spirit is the newer indigenous term. It is pretty much adopted by all North American indigenous societies. However, it is not a historic term. So, two-spirit is an umbrella term that bridges indigenous and Western understandings of gender and sexuality. It refers to someone who is outside of the gender binary. So, two-spirit people have always existed, but they didn't always have this term. Now, the reason why I say that is the lady on the screen, Weihua, is from the Zuni people in New Mexico, and she lived from 1849 to 1896. She was born biologically male, but never quite vibed with that. Always said, no, I prefer women's work, women's clothing, women's hair, women's lifestyle. And for the most part, her people said, oh, okay, then yeah, you're a woman. Or they may have had a different term for that. Now, I'm sure there were some that didn't agree, but for the most part, they were pretty accepting. Many two-spirit people historically were revered. They were seen as mystical. They were shamans. They were religious leaders because they were deemed as so tied to the divine because they don't fit into the gender binary. They walk within the worlds. But reminder, two-spirit is a closed term, meaning even if you are non-binary and you think that is a really cool term, you're right, it is a cool term. But if you are not North American Indigenous, it's not a word for us. So it is a really cool term and it is new, but it's just kind of to bridge the gap between Western understandings of gender and Indigenous understandings. And then, of course, we have non-binary, sometimes called gender non-conforming, sometimes called gender queer. It is a gender identity that is outside of the gender binary of man or woman. Anthropologically, non-binary people would be considered trans because they are saying, I disagree with my gender assigned at birth. However, leave it up to the individual. I have actually quite a few non-binary friends, and it's about 50-50. Some of them consider themselves trans, others think, no, that term doesn't apply to me. In anthropology, trans and then non-binary underneath. But for the individual, I leave it up to them. And a lot of them prefer they, them pronouns. We've always had the singular they, them in our language. We're just now using it specifically for people as their kind of identifier, as their pronouns. LGBTQ plus includes sexual orientations and gender identities. So technically, I might be wrong. I might be missing a letter. But if we included all the letters in the acronym now, it would be ridiculously long. It would be LGBTQIAAP plus. That's a long acronym. So that is why we shorten it and include the plus sign to say there's way more involved than LGBTQ, but we got to keep it short and succinct. Why are most of them sexualities, but then we have like the T for trans? That's a gender identity. Basically, it's their strength in numbers. While gender identity and sexual orientation are not the same thing, we do recognize that members within these different communities are similarly oppressed and discriminated against. And so it helps everybody band together and fight the power together rather than individually. Because if we had lesbians fighting on one part, gay men in another, queer folks over here, trans people over here, we wouldn't make as much progress. But by everybody banding together, we can kind of say, okay, we have similar needs that we need met. And I'm going to stop there. Technically, I have like 3 or 4 slides left, which bums me out because we almost got through them. But as promised, it's 7:59. So I will end there. I'm going to, while this recording processes, I'm going to double check. I have a couple emails to get through, and then I'm going to, sorry, I can't talk and do things, as I said. I'm going to double check our study guide and make sure it is updated. So by tonight, in the next hour, whatever study guide is up under week 10 or week 9, I think. What now I'm trying to remember what our Blackboard is set up as. It'll be ready for you. So I will make sure that's ready. I will give you more info on the exam. It'll be set up exactly like exam one was. And it'll be online. So other than that, you are free to go and have an awesome week, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.